America, land of the brave, home of the free, and most recently, a dying empire. As anyone with half an eyeball and an eighth of a brain can see, it's pretty much over. Game over. Dunzo. They bazinged themselves into an empire collapse speedrun because they thought that the ethnic cleansing wasn't going to affect them directly for some fucking reason. They pretty much looked at the Roman Empire, 500 years empire collapse, and then they said, hold my non-woke beer while I drown myself in my own fucking toilet. And they ended up choosing a failed coup attempt fascist with incontinence because they thought the ethnic cleansing would affect them directly. I'm sure many will be surprised when the Gestapo ends up targeting their grandmas for community gardens against the state or something like that. But anyway, that's not the point of this video. The fall of the U.S. Empire, hitherto referred as the USE, United States Empire, will most likely be fractured into different countries, effectively balkanizing. Again, many of you already know this, but the boundaries of these new countries will be determined by geography, cultural distinctions, climate, history, and other factors. And that's kind of what we want to get into today. We are going to explore what these regions could look like and a little bit about how they could come about. Now, my friend and I recently watched this YouTube video, and as two people who've lived in the U.S. for most of their lives, we thought it was kind of stupid. No offense. It's pretty good, but it makes some wild assumptions about culture and geographical boundaries. It also got us thinking. After the empire collapses, when states secede and the coalition of the willing liberates the death camps, how will the USE balkanize? Now, for reference, we watched this YouTube video after watching the 2024 Civil War movie, where instead of making inaccurate assumptions, the director Alex Garland, this guy, instead says, here's a map of the US, and I drew random lines on it, since I didn't want to be political on a Civil War movie, bro. Like, you fucking... Anyway, so for reference, here's what that map looks like. I'll make a video on that later, on the factions in the movie and why the lore is so fucking stupid. Well, without further ado, here's our initial analysis of US balkanization predictions as of September 2025. This is changing by the day. As I'm recording this, Trump just invaded DC, so, we'll see what happens. Alright, so my friend is your average American, pretty lived up, but understands more about how politics work now because they started to affect his life more directly. Yeah, who would have guessed it, right? Anyway, this is what he thinks the US will look like. And it is worth noting, this is a map for the initial balkanization of the USE in the near future, not a final map of the balkanization after full collapse. Here in the red is the empire proper, while blue represents the seceded regions, not necessarily in a union with each other, just successfully separate from the empire. The gray is just contested areas, either too close to the imperial core to fully secede, or stuck between the two factions, or with too much internal division to go in either direction. Now, what I wanted to do was take this map and expand on it as a politics autist and a geography enjoyer to see if we can't come up with a better one. Now, this is my likely scenario based on political and cultural understanding of these regions. I've been to many of these regions and lived on them myself. Now, feel free to disagree in the comments if you have different opinions. So to start with, this kind of lavender color represents all the areas far enough or with a low enough population to successfully be off the empire's radar. It would make sense for them to say, hey, we're independent, and the US to say, no, you're not, but not actually do anything about it. There's not much going on here. I know there are some cities here and there in Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Maine, but again, it is not interesting enough for the empire to care. Now, would they be under some sort of Canadian protectorate? Maybe on the low. Possibly, it's too uncertain to say. While other states like New York and Massachusetts would want to secede, they're simply too close to the core and are too important financially to be able to leave right away. Conversely, I think Alaska and Hawaii are just too far away, and assuming this is during a period of civil skirmishes culminating in a civil war, logistically, the USC will have to let go of these territories to hang on to as much of the core as they can, and that is why I have Hawaii crossed out, as I think they'd be one of the first, or the easier ones to go. It's too far away, and ever since its annexation, they have yearned for freedom. I feel like this distance from the mainland, as well as its distinct Pacific Island culture will make it an easy separation. Also, its flag looks like this. Alaska, on the other hand, has way too many resources for the empire to let go of. What it does not have enough of, however, is a population and or resources locally to sustain this population and their consumption. It relies too much on imports, so while the USC would try to hang on to it, the citizenry may choose to defect to Canada, Russia, or possibly another post-USE burgeoning nation. Now for the interesting parts. The Imperial Core. This is essentially a contraction of the Imperial Core. Side note, I will not mention any other colonies aside from Puerto Rico. Here in the red we can see the area of the USC proper, basically all of the land the regime is feasibly able to hold onto while failing to regain the defectors and slowly whittling itself away. Now, in the future, I do believe that this region would also contract, with rogue states seceding or joining other new nations nearby, but this map is for the near future. Any other speculation at this point feels irresponsible. This area includes most of the major cities in the continental imperial mass, as well as most ports, the nuke silos in Montana, and has protection from the Rockies to the west and the Atlantic Ocean to the east. I see most of the incorporated states not having an issue joining the Loyalist coalition. Most of them are former Confederacy states anyway, and would certainly be on board for this revival, and the few states that have issues would be made to stay by force, and at this point, very successfully. Now, once the secession starts, I do envision Texas here in green being opportunistic and blasting off to do some sort of libertarian hellscape, as well as possibly making some claim into the Chihuahuan Desert to its west. And we'll come back to that area here, but just so you know, that's here in green. The southern tip of Florida, here in yellow, while loyal for now, does not have the demographics to survive the ethnic cleansing, plus a lot of the Cuban Americans on the tip are Gusano descendants who have been groomed into thinking there is an imminent liberal revolution coming to the island. Could this sentiment materialize into them actually liberating themselves against an oppressive government? Maybe. Will they be in an alliance with Texas? Who knows, least of all them. So for now, they're just different colors, but there is the potential, in the near future at least, that they could form some sort of unholy, ungodly alliance. Now, the blue here could be very exciting. Right now, there are some wars going on, quote-unquote wars, right, liberal wars, going on over who can rig the system, the electoral system, the best by gerrymandering different states, which is very American. In retaliation, Trump has ordered the Loyalists to arrest the democratically elected officials of Texas right now. Eventually, I think Gary Newsom will realize he has no real shot at the presidency and secede California from the Union, you know, to get those sweet labubus from China and the Canadian dollars from tourism back. Plus, he could trade with Mexico, and California could keep its immigrant population if they haven't been holocausted by then. Together with Oregon and Washington, they could form the Pacific Northwest Corridor, or the PNW Corridor, facilitating trade with Canada and Mexico, having the protection of the Pacific on one side and the Rockies on the other, as well as the desert to its southeast. They'd be sitting pretty comfortably. Not to mention that California alone has the fourth biggest economy in the world. The PNW coalition would have a lot to gain from this union, especially if they left together. It is uncertain whether they would secede as a union or one by one with California leading the charge, but Oregon and Washington are both more progressive and culturally cohesive with each other, distinct from DC, and have a lot to gain from the separation, considering the federal taxes collected from these states served to subsidize poor flyover red states. While Nevada is basically just Vegas and a bunch of sand, I would assume they would default to the non-white Christian nationalists that would let Sin City rake in their money again. Likewise, the Mormon state would default to the union that would allow them to have freedom of religion. Arizona is progressive enough, even though Arizonans are not known for their ability to act in their own interests. It also has a ton of reservations on it, including a big part of the Navajo Nation. I think this would make it a good candidate or a good contender to join the PNW coalition. There is the concern of the U.S. currently having 5 migrant detention facilities in the state that it plans to plug into the concentration camp network and build more concentration camps in the state. Now, the USC would not very easily let go of these depending on what the labor demands were in its boundaries. Where I would draw the line for these boundaries would be around the Chihuahuan Desert and the Grand Canyon. This geography would form a natural border of what could be called disputed territory, and hopefully Denver and Albuquerque would make it into the PNW as they are more progressive cities in the region, but because it's a little bit further and closer to the USE proper, I don't know if that would be very likely. Now for the ideal model, and ideal here means the least amount of bloodshed and the best potential outcome. Keeping in mind, this is for the near future, not a final version. It looks pretty similar to the likely model with some notable differences. As of right now, New York and Minnesota governors Kathy Hochul and Tim Walz are talking about redistricting to make their states all blue. In this hypothetical scenario, these northeastern states and the Midwest 3 would be able to secede from DC without too much trouble. As I said previously, I think New York and Massachusetts are too close to the DC-Boston metro corridor and are too important to the imperial purse. But if they were able to leave without too much bloodshed, or the USC has crippled itself too much to successfully hang on to them, this would be possible. Now, this region does not have as many natural barriers as the PNW coalition would, but New York itself, which is fairly progressive for an American city and an American state, has the largest police force in the current union, as well as military gear in the form of drones, surveillance and targeting systems, submarine drones, and armed vehicles. Adding the numbers and the gear of each state's National Guard, they could form a sizable militia that would be potentially too big for the emperor to get through without spreading himself too thin. Not that this is something they typically avoid, but assuming they leave as a bloc capitalizing on their power and numbers. Having secured their secession, they could trade with each other via the Great Lakes and with Canada via existing roadways and railways. Additionally, its proximity to Europe may provide other military and trade advantages, and they are labeled here as such. In this timeline, I still think Texas, in typically Texas fashion, just sees the other states start seceding and shotguns itself out. Florida does something similar, but ideally, the whole region, along with PR, or Puerto Rico, would go to Cuba and they can form a cohesive Caribbean island nation. The other notable difference in this version of the map is that the states of Utah, Mexico, Colorado, and Arizona form a new country in the form of the new Navajo Nation, a small but overdue repatriation of the descendants of the natives that survived the genocide. How they could accomplish this is uncertain since they don't have any concrete reasons aside from financial and cultural to join one side or the other. They'd serve as more of a buffer in the lower region of the PNW coalition and the USC. Alaska and Hawaii would be much the same as the previous map. Anyway, that's it for part 1. I will try to update the series as the situation develops and secession talks continue. Also, if anyone has any recommendations for software or programs to make these maps of the US, please leave them in your comments below. Okay, love you, bye.